So when I say I'm going to take footage like this and turn it into VHS style footage, I don't mean it's going to literally look like I put it on VHS tape and this is the authentic look. No, this is stuff that's like stylistically like known as VHS. It doesn't look this messed up, but you're going to learn how to do chromatic aberration. You're going to learn how to do the screen ripple effect, scan lines, noise, a bunch of other stuff. And we're going to be doing all of this using shader nodes. Can you believe it? It's crazy. Let's get away with it, and let me just let you know that you should be quite excited for this tutorial. Nothing like this has ever been seen before. No. So buckle up, because this ride's about to go like 5 miles an hour. It's not going to be that exciting, but let's begin. Turning video into VHS using only nodes, yeah, it's probably going to be hard, but let me show you how to do it. So first thing we need to do is import our footage into Blender, and since we want to do all this with shader nodes, we can't do any of this with compositing. So age-old trick, you're going to take your camera and position it so it's kind of like hovering over the origin, and then we are going to import in a plane, and this is where our footage is going to be. So camera, make sure that it's hovering just above the plane, just so that the plane kind of like goes outside of bounds. Otherwise, we'll have some negative space here. We don't want that. So the plane is now nested inside the camera. Next, what we need to do is make it, the aspect ratio of our footage. Now, in my case, it's not 1:1, so it's not going to be like a 2:2 or whatever. It's 1920 by 1080, HD footage. So take Y and multiply it, or actually X in this case, depends on your orientation, multiplied by the aspect ratio. So 1.778. So now, if we project our footage onto this plane, we're going to be filming directly down into it and then sending it to compositing, whatever. So we have the plane, shading workspace, create a material, and I know we could do this faster with the import images as planes add-on, but we're not going to do it. So footage, I've recorded some, import it in. You can just drag and drop or shift a, do an image texture node and connect that to the surface. Now, let's see what we get so far. We got nothing, right? we get the first frame of this. Wow, my voice is flummy. We have the first frame of this. It's not playing as video, and it has nothing to do with cycles or EV or any of this. It's just a bunch of settings here. So first thing we need to do is make sure that our frame number is big enough. Now 100 is fine, or 500, whatever. This is just saying how many frames of the video do we want to play, right? So I'm going to say the first 500 frames because this is like a 4,000 frame video. But what we need to do is make sure to enable auto refresh, and also cyclic if you expect it to play a couple times. But auto refresh is what's going to let us, update frame by frame by frame. Otherwise, it's just going to take the first frame, make that a freeze frame, whatever. Okay, video imported. Now we got to do a bunch of node stuff to make it look like VHS. We'll start with the easiest and then kind of work towards the hardest. So first thing we can do is the chromatic aberration, right? Separating red, green, blue. I don't know if that's actually like physically accurate of like what happens with VHS, but whatever, we're going to do it. So RGB, we're going to not combine. We are going to separate RGB so we can look at only the red, the green, and the blue channel. And what we want to do is kind of like shift them and then recombine them, right? That's what's going to make the chromatic aberration. Now, the sad thing about this is we're going to have to copy a couple nodes a bunch of times, right? Why don't we just RGB separate and then, shift and combine? Well, because texture coordinates is what we need to manipulate in the first place. In other words, all the kind of magic happens before we get to this image texture or video nodes, right? So first of all, by the way, you can combine X, Y, Z as red, green, blue. It's the same thing. So first of all, we're going to combine red, green, blue, just like this. So we get back the original video. And now to manipulate this, we need texture coordinates. I'm just going to, instead of like a mapping node, we use something like vector math. This is just so we can add, or in other words, translate the UV coordinates. So again, this is what's going to shift only one channel. Kind of looks like 3D video, early days Shark Boy and Lava Girl before you got those polarized glasses. What we're going to need is a vector math node for each of these. Each one is going to be added, or we're going to add, rather, a different number to each. So let's do this and that, okay? What have we done here? What we've done is we've taken UV coordinates, again, what is going to tell our plane this is where we want the video. And then for each of these, we're going to filter it through a different translation, and then we're going to combine it. So red, we can shift it over to the side by like some small number. I guess the smaller, the better. You want it to be barely visible, but also big enough that you can see it. So I guess something like 0.5. Yeah, so that's very, very subtle. I'm then going to Control-C, copy that number, and then we can shift, I guess, any of these. We could do the other blue channel upwards, So this is up and down Y direction. And this is just going to be a very subtle chromatic aberration effect, okay? So any of these video clips show what we had before. I mean, a bit translated, but what we had before. We have red, we have green being shifted, blue, whatever. We combine it. Okay, chromatic aberration done. Next thing we can do is the scanline effect, because that one's also easy, and that's kind of like these vertical, or not vertical, I guess it's what you want it to be, but normally they're horizontal. Horizontal bars like a jail cell rotated 90 degrees. We're going to make that and kind of overlay it on top of this using Mix RGB, okay? Since we already have UV coordinates, we may as well use them. So separate by XYZ, and I'll explain what I'm doing in a second. We're going to be looking at the Y gradient. Why? Why? It's because it's a gradient that goes vertically, up to down. In other words, this is the information we need to make the horizontal bars, okay? We take this, we're going to multiply it by, let's say, I guess 20, 40, 80, basically the number of bars you want. So now instead of a 0 to 1 gradient as we go vertically, we multiply by 80, so 0 to 80. So you kind of squeezed in more numbers is the point vertically, and then just to get this to roll back, and this is a trick I use all the time, you set this to fraction. What does this do? We've taken a gradient, 0 to 1, multiplied it, so now it's 0 to 80, and then did a fraction command, which basically means only leave everything after the decimal point. We're going to round in some sense, right? So 2.34 becomes 0.34. Pi becomes pi, but without the 3 in the beginning, right? So now we have 80 0 to 1 gradients. And each of these gradients could then, be turned into its own bar. And, there's a bunch of ways to do this with subtraction, with greater than, less than, with comparing, but I think the easiest way to think about it is with something like greater than or less than, okay? So we're going to take our 80 0 to 1 gradients, we're going to look for where they are greater than, I think 0.5 or 0.25, that should be it. And again, the reason this works is we have a 0 to 1 gradient 80 times, and each of those we're going to say what area is above 0.5, which area is below 0.5, and that's going to give us a black and white bar for each section. If we only had this one, it would, keep everything below 0.5 black and everything above white, and then, we can control it, is the point. So this is something that you'd want to turn into a parameter. So now that we have these scan lines made procedurally, we've done the math, all we need to do to overlay these is probably the easiest way is you mix RGB. We're going to set this to multiply. In other words, we're going to choose the intensity of the colors the way you want to think about this in color math, and we are going to multiply it by what? By greater than, like that, but not as the factor, as the color. This way we actually have a factor slider to make this appear and disappear. Again, what's happening here is where we have white in the bars, it's just kind of being sent through. We're multiplying by 1, nothing changes. In the vector sense, right? We're scaling by 1. And where it's black, we're going to be taking it down to the 0 vector. It's turning into black with a factor of this. So when it's 1, full effect. When it's 0, it's not even there. And 0.5 makes it kind of subtle grayish bars. Now, again, none of this is physically accurate VCR shit. I'm just going to assume this kind of looks correct, then move on. Okay, next thing we can do is why do I keep saying VCR? VHS tapes tend to kind of look low contrasty and maybe a bit purple, stuff like that. This is something we can do very quickly, right? Brightness, contrast, boop, added in, done. Take contrast down by I don't know. I think minus 0.05 is what I experimented with before. If you go too low, it all converges to gray because that's what contrast essentially does. And notice that the order of operations matters here. I'm taking down the contrast after doing the chromatic aberration and then applying the scan lines. Otherwise, the scan lines, those black bars we made, would also be sent to gray. So this is before and after. And by the way, speaking of contrast and color and all this, we can also do some kind of post-processing effects, or I guess color management effects, like right off the fly. Right on the fly? On the fly, on the wall. Okay, either way, go to color management, view transform. Right now it's set to filmic, which is actually helping us. Normally we keep this set to standard, so the view transform doesn't mess with anything, so this is what our footage would look like if we ran these operations. But filmic, which does a lot of dynamic range stuff, actually helps us because it makes it look even more grayish and low contrasty, and you can even make that more intense with the medium low contrast look, etc. And I want to make these scan lines more intense now. Okay, so far, and by the way, this all works with video. Wow, my forehead is huge. What we have is the chromatic aberration, we have the scan lines, we have the low contrast, and I guess there's one or two more things we should add, namely noise, kind of like cell noise. because, we don't have a high resolution thing and should kind of look like we're, filming with a piece of dog shit and, sending it through Blender and all this. So we should add noise, and I guess we should also add, I guess we could do some post-processing effects with compositing. I guess one thing we can do is that vertical line thing that distorts it. So starting off with the noise, because it's a bit easier, the way you do this is we're going to use texture coordinates. Yes, we have the UV back there, but it's all the way back there. So I'm not going to use it. And by the way, I guess saving is a good idea. VHS. We're going to use these UV coordinates to generate our cell noise. How? The easiest way is using white noise. And white noise is a node, if we use our UV coordinates, that generates a random number uniformly between 0 and 1 for each kind of point or dot on our texture space, right? Which makes it look like static. I don't know if YouTube compression kills it, but the point is we have 0 to 1 on every point, but instead we want it discrete, right? Per cell, per pixel, per whatever the fuck, right? To do this, what we need to do is make our texture coordinates discrete. If that is discrete, then each cell or each block is going to give a random number using this white noise. Okay, what do I mean? The way we do this is we do Voronoi textures, the fastest method I found. Because when you take Voronoi texture, bring the randomness down to 0, the math or the algorithm behind how Voronoi texture is generated, it creates cells is the point. And if we were to look at these position values, in other words, texture space, but kind of made discrete. So here's our UV coordinates, kind of a continuous space. With Voronoi, it's been broken up into blocks, you can see. And by the way, we can control the scale here. This is going to make our texture space discrete. In other words, each of these blocks is going to be sent through white noise, which then uses some kind of function to give one input and send it to one output. So white noise now gives us cell noise. By the way, if you have this kind of rectangle issue, even though you're using something like, let's say, object coordinates, which should not, be affected by this kind of thing, make sure that you Control A apply scale, right? This is going to make it so that object space, I guess, isn't stretched out, because object space is kind of independent of our kind of, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is UV space. You can see it actually stretches with it, which is what makes it look like a rectangle before, whereas object space doesn't have this issue, at least when we apply scale is the point. So do that, and also with the scale, bring it up until it's like the size of a pixel or less or whatever. And this is how you generate noise. By the way, to animate this, fastest way, 4-dimensional noise. We're going to take a 3-dimensional cross-section of a 4-dimensional noise. Don't worry about it. We get this W slider. It's effectively a seed. Type in hash frame, which is going to make a driver, so that every frame 63, we get the value 63, 64, 65, etc. Right? In other words, the frame number is going to drive, driving into a drive the W slider, okay? Which is what's going to make it animated. To include this, again, order of operations matters here. I don't know what technically is correct. I'm just going to put it below the scan line, so that's not affected. To do that, we're going to use another multiplication. We're going to multiply by this one this time. So if we view it, you see we get our chromatic aberration, but this time with some noise, just like last time. The factor is going to control how intense this is going to be, because we're using a black and white kind of cell noise. Which when we multiply, it makes it like intensity and stuff like that. So now we can control how shitty it looks, which is great. Also scan lines on top of that, and now we have this kind of built-up effect of chromatic aberration, of contrast, clipping kind of shit, of noise, of scan lines. And I think finally, for this part of it before compositing, let's do that kind of vertical. Is it vertical? It's a horizontal bar moving vertically, distorting this, okay? And the fact that we kind of explained it that way, it's a horizontal bar moving vertically, tells us the whole story of how it is we want to make it, right? If we want a horizontal bar, what we need is, again, to separate the UV space, because it's going to give us this gradient going vertically that we can use to generate the bar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run some different math. Like last time, we ran some multiplication, some fraction, whatever, to get a bunch of bars. This time we want a single bar that is moving. So take y. We are going to set this to, I guess, subtract, or we could do compare. I'm going to set this to subtract because now we basically have created a distance function, kind of. In other words, what we've done is we took this gradient and we're saying, what is the distance from that to this number, 0.5, and we can shift that up and down as it, as we want it to go up and down is the point. So we have a distance function. By the way, since this is subtraction, some values are going to be black. In other words, negative below 0, we don't see them. So just to bring those back, we just use absolute value. If you ever took something like a real analysis class, this is familiar, right? Absolute value is the distance function on the real numbers. It's the normal metric. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I did at some point, but now I don't. So subtraction, absolute value gives us the distance of any part of our gradient to, I guess, 0.5, which kind of looks like a bar going up and down, okay? We kind of want to invert this because we want the white area to be what's being distorted, so not like everything except this, but only the white bar. So I'm just going to invert this using a color ramp. Why that, but not an inversion node? The reason is this way we get to invert it and also get to choose kind of the width or the intensity of this effect, okay? So I'm going to make a color ramp with both these handles super close to each other. Now to make the scroll, so this is before we do any kind of distortion, to make the scroll, what we need to do is if we're doing this subtraction, we need to take our gradient and have it kind of always be moving up and down and changing, right? Because this block right here gives us the distance and it gives us the bar, but the gradient is what should be changing. So if we have the order of operations correct, what we do is we add, and just like last time, we want to add based on the frame number. So, on frame 1, we're adding 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. This time, and you can do expressions here, by the way, this time I'm going to divide by something like, 50. And this should be dependent on your frame rate, right? If you have something that's very high frame rate, you want this number to be very big as well. So we're slowing down by a lot. So let's say over 60, so it takes 1 full second for this to swipe. However, if we do this now, you can see it's doing that scrolling thing, and it kind of looks correct, right? It's giving us that distance function, but it's moving. However, when we, leave the plane, it's gone, right? So somehow we needed to know that when we go back here, it should roll back on top, right? And that's exactly like, if you think about it, right? It's exactly what the fraction thing was doing before. Or is it the fraction? I guess fraction or modulo would both do it. So same idea. We take fraction, we put it here, and now we get a repeating bar. So when this is adding something above 1, in other words, it's out of bounds of this plane, we use fraction, we delete everything other than what's past the decimal point. In other words, we get rid of the integer, we only get point whatever, which maps it back here. And then we do the distance function. Okay, how do we use this thing, which again, we can change the, not the distance, the speed of, also the distance using the color ramp. How do we use this to distort? The way we do this is I'm first going to group these. So everything past this point is, again, what's controlling our chromatic aberration, and everything after that, what we want to do is distort it before we get to that point. To do this, we can do a addition, or I guess there's a couple ways we could do it. I'm going to do it with addition. So I'm going to take our UV coordinates before they're getting separated and all this. We are going to add using combine X, Y, Z, so we can pick if we want to add it to X, Y, or Z. I'm going to shift, so even though this is going vertically, we want it to shift, like left and right. So we take this, we shift it on the x-axis, the one that's going left and right, and let's see what we get so far. So what we should be getting is everything we've done so far, but now with this bar going up and down. Now, it kind of looks like, there's an intense amount of distortion here, I'd say, and that's because there is an intense amount of distortion. To make it less crazy, first of all, we make it wider. So it has a larger radius of effect, and since there's a gradient baked in here, already looks better. And another thing we can do is also make the brightest part of this bar, again, the white area. We can take this and bring down the intensity. In other words, what we are adding to the x-axis or shifting is going to be less substantial, okay? So we take this, and then we can, pick a value on the fly. So when it's 0, no distortion, 1 is maximum distortion. You want it to be kind of subtle. Okay, so now we have this. And by the way, since this is a linear, we're getting this V shape. You could do any kind of interpolation you want. So easing, you can actually see the, this is cool. You can actually see the, not the cross section, but the graph for what these interpolation methods give. So ease kind of gives a bell curve. Bezier, or B-spline, is going to give a B-spline. We can do cardinal, which should give us something kind of circular, even though it kind of looks like a cone, whatever. I'm going to choose ease because it looks the best, and we can also take down this intensity a bit more. Okay, so now we have a repeating effect that we can control, again, how wide it's going to be and a bunch of other stuff. But at this point, let me just take it down a bit more. At this point, I think I'm happy with this. So again, this is a mess. By the way, here's a screenshot if you want to look at it all at once. We've messed around with the distortion. We then separated it for the chromatic aberration, which we then combined XYZ, which is the same as RGB, contrast change, noise generated by white noise, and then we multiplied the scanline calculation, right? And all of this is to say, we have a camera pointing down at all this thing that's being updated procedurally. At any point, you can change the video here and automatically get the same result, since all these nodes are independent of it. We have a camera pointing down. Here's the point, which means that when we're in Eevee and all this, we hit render. You see, we're going to basically render what we see on the plane, which means that everything we've done gets sent to compositing in the render layers node, right? It gets sent here, and we can actually do kind of more post-processing. Now, this part isn't necessarily procedural in the sense that, we have all these parameters that we can turn into a node group and all this, right? This is kind of a post effect, but if we're rendering anyways, it's fine to do it this way. So we can even add in more effects. And I'm not going to do anything too intense here because we already did quite a bit. Let's also bring down the contrast a bit more. So last things I'm going to do here is, first of all, send it through a filter. And I like to keep this on soften, and this is just going to make it, so I'm going to zoom in here. So this is before softening, after. It's just going to make it a tiny bit softer. The whole thing, including the scan lines, you can go above 1. And the other thing I do is the lens distortion. Put that in there, set this to fit, and do distortion 0.02. This is just going to give it a bit of a fisheye effect, which isn't inherent to VCR, just to the cameras that we'd be using to film to the tapes. And by VCR, I mean VHS, of fucking course. But there's the post effects. Again, if you do not like the look of this, like the noise is too intense, there's too much color, you can always go back to shading workspace, mess around with these numbers on the fly. Again, that's the point. So I want even less contrast, re-render, and it's going to send it through the softening, through the filter node and the lens distortion. So there you go. That is the VHS effect in excruciating detail, even though something like DaVinci and Premiere has this as kind of like an open effects preset. You can literally just drop this effect. This is how you do it in Blender, right? You just turn this into a node group, which I'll do if you want to get this via Patreon and stuff like that. You turn it into a node group with a bunch of sliders, and we've effectively made the same thing. So end of the tutorial. If you want to get this project file without spending 20-some minutes, I don't know how long it took, making it yourself, you just want the result that you can just, pick a video and put it in here. That's going to be available via Patreon, so you can get it there. Also, any other Blend file I've ever made, it's also there. If you want early access, Discord access, exclusive tutorials, things that are not available to other people, that also exist there. Thanks to all 660, last I checked, patrons who are enjoying those benefits, and they also have bigger penises, it's true. And yeah, there you go, tutorial, it's done. Thanks for watching.